I'd like to welcome everyone. Hello, good evening, good morning, whatever part of the world and time zone that you happen to be in. We are in for a real treat today. I'm honored to be able to introduce to everyone Robert Hockett, and he is a law professor at Cornell University. And so basically, Robert, we would like to be able to talk about your experience and your understanding of crypto, your background, where you came from, about that. And I know that you have written something very interesting for all of our audience, which is the Digital Dollar Act of 2020, correct?
That's right, yeah.
And so, so what I'd like to do then is just have you say hello to everyone. And we just started a little bit a second ago on a conversation, and it was the kind of thing exactly that I felt like our audience would like to hear. So I'd like you to just go ahead and start that over again and let everybody know what was on your mind.
Great, thank you so much, Scott. So, I mean, my own background is I'm actually down from your part of the country. I grew up in New Orleans. And as you know, one thing that New Orleanians like is sort of out of the box type stuff. We kind of like what's sort of a little unusual or a little bit sort of change of pace. I suppose that's probably one of the reasons I got interested in money from a kind of scholarly or legal point of view, rather than just from a sort of how do I earn it or how do I get it point of view. It's sort of historically a very interesting subject. In fact, I can think of very few subjects that are more interesting, believe it or not, than the history of money. The only history I can think of that might be more interesting than the history of money is the history of the United States.
Yes.
And right, so that in turn makes, you know, for an ideal subject for somebody with my particular interest, the history of the dollar, right, the history of the American money. So I do a lot of my scholarly work is sort of focused on that, and then a lot of the sort of policy and legislative work that I do tends to be informed by that. Because often it turns out that, you know, we did something that was pretty cool back in the 19th century and we've kind of forgotten about it now. And so oftentimes, if you just sort of rediscover some things that we used to do and sort of forgot about, you get some pretty good clues as to sort of how we can do things better right now. So, you know, that's by way of a kind of a general background sort of story, right? Sort of why I'm interested in this, sort of how I got into it. As for the story itself, this gets much more interesting, I think, than my own sort of autobiography. So if we go back to the US, let's say around the 1850s or so, there was no paper dollar bill at that time that was issued by any particular government agency or government authority. There were just what were called private banknotes floating around. So individual banking companies would basically put out their own paper dollars, and the dollar was the unit of account in America, but it wasn't an actual unit of currency that we as a public or as a country ever sort of put out. We had, of course, silver dollars, you know, sort of coin dollars, but there was no paper money that the US government put out. So you had these paper banknotes that banks would put out, and the paper was, in a sense, a bit like a kind of claim check. You know, if you go to to a museum like Colonial Williamsburg or someplace, and you're carrying around stuff that they don't want you to carry around in the museum, like a big backpack, or even if they allow you to carry it, but you just don't want to have to be weighed down with it, you can often leave your stuff at a desk, like the coat check woman or whatever will take your coat and hang it up, and then they give you a little claim check, which entitles you to sort of claim it back, right? You can come back and you can get your coat or your umbrella or your backpack or whatever. And the paper currency that circulated in this time was a bit like that. It sort of entitled you to a little bit of gold, in essence, or some other item that was thought to be intrinsically valuable, like maybe a share in a piece of property or a share in a bit of land or something. So the bank might hold that like real value or real wealth in its vault, so to speak. And then it would put out these paper notes as sort of claim checks that people could then use. Essentially, they could always trade them in for those other things. But people preferred the paper as a medium of exchange in transactions because it was just easier to carry. You know, it's just lighter weight. That seems to be one of the origins of paper money as a just in general. You know, even over in Europe, apparently the first bankers in Europe who started issuing paper money were goldsmiths and metalsmiths of other kinds. And people would just leave their gold, you know, in the safe that the goldsmith had to have as part of his profession. and then the goldsmith would give you a paper claim check so you could come back and get your gold later. And at some point, people got the bright idea that, if I want to pay somebody, instead of going back and getting gold and then having to lug it over, it's pretty heavy stuff, as you know.
Yeah.
Right. And so instead of having to lug it over somewhere, I'll just use the paper instead. So I'll simply transfer my claim to the gold to you, Scott, and then you can always claim the gold if you want. And at some point, the banks get kind of smart and they realize, well, it doesn't happen very often that people want to take the gold back out. So we can actually issue more claim checks than there is gold. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. We can actually, the circulating paper can actually outnumber, so to speak, or can go out in a larger quantity than the amount of gold itself. And that seems to be the origin of fractional reserve banking, right? The whole idea of fractional reserve banking seems to originate in that practice. And the reason I think that the princes of the time, or the dukes or whatever they were in medieval and early Renaissance Italy allowed it, and then the reason that entire nation states allowed it once we moved to a sort of nation state system in the 16th century, was that it allowed the money supply itself to be sort of flexible. I mean, the term of art that we use now is elastic. You could have an elastic currency, mm-hmm. meaning that you weren't the amount of money out there didn't necessarily have to be limited by the amount of gold that you happen to have, and that could be an advantage because, of course, one way that we spur economic growth is by growing the money supply just enough to enable just enough transacting to happen, to enable people to come up, basically build new factories or build new ways of building things and basically add wealth to society over time. So anyway, so you come back then into 19th century America, and we were basically just repeating that practice that had been begun in Europe close to, probably 700 years before, maybe 600 years before. And it was again, private sector banks that did that. The problem, of course, with this arrangement was then that you had a lot of different paper currencies floating around, and different banks were differently able to sort of manage their affairs well and thus live up to their obligations. Mm-hmm. So if it was like let's say it was the Piedmont Bank, let's use a word that has a good meaning in North Carolina. Yep. If there was something called Piedmont Bank, it might be very well run, very well managed by the bankers. And hence, it might be very, entirely good for its obligations, meaning that if you, Scott, or I, Bob, go over there and hand over one of their banknotes, they have the gold or they have whatever the real asset is mm-hmm. that the paper is meant to represent. And so it's fine. And so if that dollar bill says $1, it is actually worth $1. And of course, the word that we use in finance for that is we say it trades at par, which is just to say that the face value and the real value are the same. But other banks might not be run so well, right? So you might imagine, let's say, Charleston Bank down in South Carolina, maybe it wasn't run as well. Maybe these were a bunch of, kind of raucous seafaring people out of Charleston, and maybe sometimes we're a little bit profligate, right, with their assets in the way that the North Carolinians were not, right? Yeah. Right. They were sort of more like Jean Lafitte from my part of the South, from New Orleans, than they were like, say, James Madison from just a little bit north of you, So, if Charleston Bank wasn't really run very well, then a Charleston dollar note might trade at less than par. So it'll say $1, but people actually treat it as being worth 50 cents, let's say. And right. You see where this is going. If you have like 10 or 20 banks doing this, they might all have different valued currencies, even though they all say $1 on them. And that, of course, made transacting quite inefficient, right? You go to the general store mm-hmm. and you want to buy, I don't know, a few pounds of flour, some bacon grease, who knows what, maybe a hoe or any other thing that you buy at the general store. And let's say your bill, the guy behind the counter says, that'll be like let's say $8, because $1 would have bought you a lot back then. So $8, but then you pull out $8 bills, but each one is from a different bank. Well, then what the guy behind the counter would have to do is he'd have to go back and look at a list that they always kept nailed to the wall, basically telling you what percentage to discount each bank's notes by. So he, on his list, it would say, Piedmont Bank, 100%. South Carolina, Charleston Bank, 50%, Pecos Bill Bank, 25%, and then Jean Lafitte Bank, 2% or whatever. And then he would he would have to discount each note and then add up all of those discounted quantities to determine the value of what you would actually put down on the counter.
So in other words, Bob, the ledger was not interoperable.
Exactly. There you go.
Had to be done manually and took time.
Beautifully put, Scott. Couldn't have put it better. That's a nice, concise way of getting it across, right? I mean, that could almost be like, that's almost bumper sticker length. That's perfect. That should be the slogan. You could almost say that the whole first half of the 19th century was a non-interoperable period in our monetary history.
Right.
It was all just a great big jumbled mess.
Yeah.
So, needless to say, then that just didn't that didn't lend itself to efficient transacting, and that meant that it stood as a kind of impediment to economic growth. So, people were sort of remarking for a long time that this is not so good. There must be some better way to do this. And then the Civil War comes along, and it became an even more problematic thing because the federal government had to spend money to requisition supplies to sort of pay to, and then the South, the Confederate States, also had to, spend money to requisition supplies or purchase supplies and things like that in the conduct of the war. And so, ironically, both sides, the North and the South, sort of realized that some kind of monetary uniformity was going to be necessary so that basically everybody could transact in the same currency.
Right.
So in the South, as you know, they started issuing their own money, these Confederate bills.
Confederate dollars.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And these were issued by the CSA, the Confederate States of America, not by private sector banking institutions. And then likewise up in the North, whose law we ended up living with because of who won and so forth and how the Civil War came to an end. Basically, we ended up with the Northern system, but the Northern system was essentially the same as the Confederate system. The legislative home of it is basically three bills that were passed by Congress in rapid succession. One was called the National Bank Act, another was called the National Currency Act, and then finally another one was called the Legal Tender Act. And what those all combined to give us was a particular arrangement that we actually still live with to this day, with one minor change that I'll get to. And that was, first of all, we established a new kind of bank, basically a nationally chartered bank, as distinguished from a state chartered bank. You might have seen the names of some banking institutions followed by a comma and then the letters NA. So let's see, I think up in Charlotte, isn't Bank of America headquartered up in Charlotte?
Yes.
Not too far from you. So, yes. Right. So, yeah, Bank of America, which is headquartered up in Charlotte, even though it is basically a North Carolina bank originally, it has a national charter. So if you look at their full name, it'll say Bank of America, comma, NA. And NA does not mean not available in this case. It means national, although some people might think it should. It should mean that, given the way they sometimes behave. But really, it just abbreviates National Association. That was the term of art that we used in the 19th century. A national bank was called the National Banking Association. And so the abbreviation just came to be National Association, or NA. So the first thing that we did through the National Bank Act is we established this whole system of nationally chartered banks. Then we said that they are all going to issue exactly the same paper currency, even if they're different private sector corporations. They're still, as national banks, going to issue a national currency instead of their own individual private currencies. So Bank of America is a private sector bank. Wells Fargo is a private sector bank. But they both, if you go to the teller window and you ask for cash, they don't give you a Bank of America note or a Wells Fargo note. They give you a dollar bill.
Right.
So effectively, we said, okay, if you have a national charter, you can still be anywhere. You can be in North Carolina, or you can be out in California like Wells Fargo is, but you're still going to issue the same currency. And then we put in charge of that system a new regulator who we put in the Treasury Department, which is interesting for reasons we'll get into in a minute. That new regulator was called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or the OCC. Now, as you doubtless know, the OCC remains one of our most important bank regulators, even to this very day. But people sometimes wonder, where did it get that weird name? Because all that it does now is it charters the banks, right? If you want to become a national bank, you have to apply for a license, basically, and you apply for that license to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And everybody in the banking field sort of knows this. This is quite familiar. This has been the arrangement for over 150 years now. But people do sometimes wonder, well, why is it called the comptroller of the currency? What does that have to do with anything? Well, this is the reason. It's because originally those banks were also issuing the currency, because the dollar bill, and here's where it gets kind of even more interesting. The dollar bill that we have today, its original version was something called the greenback, which you of course doubtless know about. And the greenback was actually issued by the U.S. Treasury Department. So the comptroller was the controller of the currency. So that was the thing. So the idea was that the comptroller of the currency regulates this new kind of bank called the national bank, basically in order to maintain the safety and soundness of the bank, so that the currency will retain its value, you see. So let's imagine that, let's say that you had different banks that operated according to different standards before the National Banking Act. So in our previous example, we imagined Piedmont Bank being run really well, very efficiently, but we imagined maybe Charleston Bank not so much.
No.
Well, right.
So the comptroller would be the person that would be in charge of contacting them and saying, here's where it's going wrong, here's what we need to do better.
Beautiful. Exactly. Just so. That's exactly right. So what would happen is, the now Charleston Bank, if it wanted a national charter, it would have to comply with the safety provisions, right, that the comptroller imposed. And the comptroller might very well have gotten the standards from simply by looking at how Piedmont Bank functioned. The comptroller might have thought, well, look, there's this bank before I existed, right? Before the National Banking Act. And so before there was even this new office called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, I happened to know a bit about banking, and I happened to watch how banks operated. And I always admired how the Piedmont Bank operated. So that will be the standard. We'll simply say, okay, all banks have to be as good, as above board as Piedmont Bank is. That will be a national standard now, rather than just Piedmont Bank standard. And that will be the condition that you have to meet if you want to be essentially able to deal in the new national currency called the greenback. That was right. So that was the arrangement. That was the system that we work with. And as the name itself of the currency suggests, the greenback looked a lot like the dollar bill that we have to this day, right? There might have been, I think actually George Washington, I believe, was on it from the very beginning, because of course everybody admired Washington. You could be no matter what part of the country you were from, you recognize that George Washington was a hero, a great Virginian and a great American. But the greenback looked a lot like the current dollar bill. There was only one problem with it, you might say, that began to kind of become obvious during the industrialization of the country in the later half of the 19th century, like starting around the 1870s, 1880s or so. And that was that basically the American economy began to grow so rapidly with the industrialization that we really needed the currency to be what we call an elastic currency, which is to say we needed the currency to be such that you could grow the supply of it in order to accommodate growing demand for currency in transactions as the economy grows, but also to be able to contract it if it got out of hand, right? So if we started to have inflation, you would need some way of basically calling some of that money back in to stop the inflation. But by the same token, if we had deflation, because the demand for money exceeded the supply of it, you needed to be able to increase the money supply too. And so I think of that as sort of like modulation, right? You modulate the money supply by expanding it when you need to, contracting it when you need to. And for various reasons, the Treasury Department wasn't very good at doing that. And so we asked ourselves, so how do we deal with, or how do we manage a system involving an elastic currency? And then we looked at certain other countries and we thought, what seems to work pretty well for that is something called a national bank. And we didn't have one. So, the Bank of England seemed to be pretty good at modulating the supply of pounds sterling. The Banque de France seemed to be pretty good at modulating the supply of francs at that time. It wasn't so good later, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was pretty good at that. The German Bundesbank as well, quite good at that. So we decided to establish our own version of a central bank here in America. But it took a while to figure out how to do that, because although we felt like we had that same need like those modern European countries had, since our economy was becoming big and modern and so forth, we also had something that they didn't have, and that was a federated republic, right, where our country is spread over an entire continent and it's divided into sort of separate political units called states, where tastes vary, cultures vary, preferences vary. And of course, even local economies vary, right? The economy of North Carolina is quite different from the economy of South Dakota, say. So we thought we need a central bank that can be sort of responsive to and attentive to regional differences across the country. So it took us a while to figure out how to do that. And then we ended up coming up with the Federal Reserve, which, as you know, the full name of is Federal Reserve System. And we're really, the word system there really means something. It's not just sort of there as a kind of window dressing word. The whole idea is that we don't have just one Federal Reserve Bank. We have a sequence of regional Federal Reserve banks in the plural. I believe you in North Carolina probably work most closely with the Reserve Bank of Richmond, right? The Federal Reserve of Richmond is sort of your zone.
Right. The closest one to us. Yeah.
Yeah. And then a little further south of you, and what would have been my Fed bank in New Orleans is the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, which is another major Federal Reserve bank. And then up here in upstate New York, where I am now, even though I basically live in the forest, as you can see, you can probably see my ceiling on air here. It's kind of basically like a cabin. I'm in a very kind of rural, woodsy part of New York, way out in the middle of the state. But the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is located in New York City, that would be my Fed if I were a business person out here in Ithaca. And indeed, I bank with a very small little kind of community bank here in Ithaca called Tompkins Trust. And Tompkins Trust deals with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York because we're just in its region. So basically, the Federal Reserve System is called the system because it's sort of disaggregated. Or to use language that you and I might be more inclined to use nowadays, since we're both in the crypto space, it's distributed. It's a sort of distributed central bank, you might say.
Right.
Right, or at least that's what it's supposed to be. Now, so once we created it or established it in 1913, we gave it sort of the administrative responsibilities with respect to the currency. We took it out of Treasury and put it in this new Fed. And that is why, if any of your viewers or you pull a dollar bill or 5 or 10 or 20 or whatever, out of your pocket, it says Federal Reserve Note. So so the dollar bill is now administered by the Fed, but it was originally administered by Treasury. And that's why if you actually, you know what, give me a second. I've got a Treasury, an old Treasury one. Let me pull it up here. I'll show it to you. It's really interesting.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So
now, one of the things while you're grabbing that, if you can still hear me, I'm sure that you have read or listened to the audio tape of The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Yes, yeah, I read the book.
He didn't really put a very positive spin on the creation of the Fed.
Yeah,
I remember correctly, he was kind of trying to say that it was a move by the people who are in control of the money to be able to keep control of the money.
Yeah. Yeah, there's an element of truth in that, Scott. There's a bit of truth in that I think we should talk about, and so I'll come to that in just a second.
Okay.
You could say that what I've just sort of said is basically that was the sort of, how should I put it? That was the
party line.
That was the party. Yeah, beautiful. See, you're much better at this than I am. I should ask you to help me abbreviate my own long-winded talking. Yeah, that was the party line, right? That was the sort of the best case scenario, so to speak. And of course, as my mom always used to say, if you're trying to sell something, you accentuate the positive.
Yeah.
That was even a jazz song, right? Was it? You got to accentuate the positive. So
eliminate the negative.
Yeah, exactly. So accentuating the positive was basically to tell the story that I just told. And yeah, it does bear noting that that's the sort of whitewashed version. And there's an element of truth to the whitewashed version, but there's also an element of falsehood. So we'll definitely get to that. But I just wanted to show you really quickly. I don't know if it might be too reflective, but you see across the top, it doesn't say Federal Reserve Note, does it? It says silver certificate. But otherwise, it looks like a dollar. Doesn't see? I'll put it up closer.
Yeah.
See that?
I got it.
But on the other hand, it looks like a dollar. George Washington, the whole bit.
Yeah.
The greenback is a bit like that, right? This is a sort of a latter day greenback. There was a brief while when Treasury basically was issuing paper notes that
Mhm.
were backed up by silver, and they were
Uh-huh.
called silver certificates.
Yep.
And this is that. So it's not an actual greenback, but it's the same kind of thing. And the main
Yeah.
point is just that something can look. Oh, by the way, if I show you the back, it's identical to a dollar bill. Just as one United States of America.
Yeah. We
One
have our
dollar. See?
Freemason
See?
artwork.
Yeah, that whole Freemason thing, the Great Seal. So you see, it looks like an ordinary dollar bill,
Yep.
and all that changes is the official organ of government that is charged with administering it. Right.
Right.
So what we did, getting back then to the whitewash story, in the sense in which it was a whitewash on the one hand, and the sense in which it was sort of partly true on the other, is we just said, okay, look, here's this thing that looks like this.
Yeah.
The Treasury Department administers it. We need to be able to kind of adjust the supply of it in a flexible way. The Treasury is not so good at doing that. So let's create a central bank that can do that, because that's what central banks do. And then let's address the fears that people have of concentrating too much money power in one government office by making it a federated structure. And that was again, the party's point of truth to it, in the sense that there is at least the sort of institutional infrastructure of the Fed is such that it could be made into what the party line always said that it is. The problem, and here's where we get to the interesting stuff, is that it actually isn't what they said that it is. And so we actually have to do something different to make it what it was supposed to be in the first place. So I'm kind of, I think, almost by metabolism, an optimist, which is to say that I always think there's a way to make stuff better, even if most other people think it's a hopeless cause. I think the Fed can be made better. And if I were to accentuate the positive, I would basically say the institutional structure is very well suited to making it what it should be, making the Fed what it should be. But we don't use that institutional structure in the way that we should. I'll come back to that in detail shortly. Okay. But the short play, one really easy short play is offering assistance to hard-hit cities and states that are having trouble dealing with the pandemic. They introduced a new liquidity facility in early April called the Municipal Liquidity Facility. And the idea here is to let states like North Carolina or New York, or cities like Chapel Hill or Ithaca or whatever, basically borrow really cheaply from the Fed if they're having trouble because of the tax take, because sales taxes are down because everybody's
nobody's spending anything.
Yeah, so it's a facility that has a great deal of potential to help cities and states out right now at a time when they're especially stressed. But here's the problem: it's being administered out of the New York Fed office in Lower Manhattan, 2 blocks from Wall Street. That makes no sense, right? I mean, you've got, let's say you're in Hawaii, and you're a hard hit. There are a lot of hard hit cities in Hawaii, believe it or towns at least. What do people at the New York Fed know about Hawaii? Or even if you're in South Dakota or in Utah or something, what does the New York Fed know about Utah? And how is the New York Fed supposed to help out cities in Utah? So I think, here we're not even using the institutional structure that we have, in the sense that we actually have a bunch of separate Federal Reserve banks in different parts of the country. I would have thought, call me crazy, but if Chapel Hill or if Charlotte, North Carolina needed a bit of low-cost borrowing from the Fed to help it over the current hump, it might be a good idea. Exactly. You got it, right? It might be a good idea to let them go to Richmond, right? Why should they have to apply for funds from New York? And the thing is, putting this in the New York Fed only serves to confirm the nightmare story that people like the Jekyll Island author and others have noted, right? Which is that it was all basically to put control in the New York money center banks, not even in the United States, but in Wall Street banks. So, it's not a good idea. And we'll come back to that, I think, because there are a lot of reforms I think we could make along these lines. I've got a piece out. I'll actually email it to you. Maybe, no, I don't know if I haven't sent it to you yet. I'll send you a piece I wrote a little bit ago called Spread the Fed. And it's basically arguing for a distributed Fed. But anyway, back to the sort of how this links up to crypto. Once we put things in the Fed, we essentially got to our current paper money system. The paper money system that we have now has not really changed since 1913. There were a number of important tweaks that were made to the Fed system about 20 years later in the Banking Acts of 1933 and 35. In the basically the real early New Deal period, when President Roosevelt, right after President Hoover, was still responding to banking crises. Right, Hoover responded quite admirably to these crises, but he didn't finish the job because he lost the election. So FDR had to kind of finish the job that Hoover started in fixing the banks. And so some of the congressional enactments of 1933 and 35 were devoted to fixing up the banking system a bit more, including with the Glass-Steagall Act and other things. And you might say that those tweaked the Fed system a bit, but in essentials, the Fed system that we have now that administers our paper dollar has been in place ever since 1913, and we still basically have then that same money system. Now, here's where I think it gets interesting for crypto, or just for, let's say, digital currencies even more broadly. With the large number of different digital currencies that are out there now, with Bitcoin, Ethereum, and I can't even, there are too many for any of us to name at this point, I suspect.
Over 5,000 of them, Bob.
There we go. I'm glad to know, Scott. Yeah, because you're probably. I should probably stay in touch with you just to keep up with the number, because it keeps growing. And just to show you, like the last time I checked, I think we were still just a little under 4,000. So I sort of stopped counting when the boxer Manny Pacquiao said that he was going to issue a digital currency.
I heard that. Yeah.
Remember that? Yeah. I think he calls it the Pac coin. And I thought, what in the hell? I mean, he's a great boxer. Don't get me wrong. He's a legend. He's one of the greatest of the sort of lightweight and welterweight boxers of all time. Manny Pacquiao, all praise to Manny. But why a Pac coin, right? Why does a boxer have to issue a digital currency?
Right.
But in any event, so I think it seems to me that there's a pretty close analogy that can be drawn between all of these different digital that are privately issued on the one hand, and all of those paper banknotes on the other hand, right? Those paper currencies that used to be bank-centered rather than government-centered in the 19th century, they took on a name. We call them wildcat currencies, even to this day, and that sort of, to some extent, I think, conveys what the problem was with them, right? That they were a little bit kind of uncontrollable, and so they could kind of wildly fluctuate in value. And you see the same thing, I think, with the multiplicity of digital currencies now. I call it wildcat crypto because they all fluctuate wildly in value relative to one another, and that makes them kind of not altogether stable as monies. And that's, of course, why we have stable coins now too. But of course, one of the ironies of stable coins is that one of the principal ways that the stable coins stay stable is by backing themselves with sovereign currencies, like dollars, right? And you want to say, well, okay, if in order to maintain the stability of a stable coin, you have to back it with dollars, why don't you just have digital dollars? So what I would argue is we're still currently, if you think of the pre-1860s as sort of phase one, the wildcat phase, then think of the interval between Treasury and the Fed as the sort of phase two, and that's where the Treasury or the fiscal authority administers the currency. And then think of the post-Fed era as phase three, which is basically the central bank administered digital currency. Then we're sort of in phase one where digital is concerned. Now, what I've been arguing then, and this is where the kind of learning from history becomes sort of relevant, is I think that there's a reason that we proceeded through those phases in the way that we did. And in consequence, I think that there's a very good case to be made for going through sort of the same phases now. And by that, I mean then start with the Treasury Department for a digital dollar rather than with the Fed. And there are several reasons I have for that. One is the Treasury Department is more democratically accountable than the Fed. Another is that the Treasury is more nimble than the Fed. It can act more quickly. And then finally, thirdly, and a third reason is that the Treasury already has the infrastructure in place. So now I'm going to blow some of your viewers' minds because I'm guessing that some of them don't know about this because almost nobody does. It's so weird that it never became like famous, but it's there. So any of your viewers who are interested, I would say after they're not watching, after we're done, go to the web, go to Google, and just Google Treasury Direct. And that will take you immediately to a website that's administered by the U.S. Treasury. You can open up an account with the Treasury Department. And it takes 5 minutes. And through that account, you can basically transact with Treasury in Treasury securities. That's to say, you can buy U.S. savings bonds, you can buy Treasury bills, you can buy Treasury notes. There you go. Oh, thanks so much, guys. So yeah, any of those Treasury securities that all the big banks are typically buying to kind of hold as safe assets as parts of their portfolios. You don't have to be a big bank or a big Wall Street investment house to do that. You, Scott, or I, Bob, could do that right now. All we need to do is we just open the account. All you need is a taxpayer ID number or a social security number, and then a bank account, and then you can just sort of transfer money from your bank account to this Treasury Direct account to buy Treasury securities, and then you can always sell them back at any time. You can liquidate them at will as well, and basically convert them back into dollars. Now, it seems to me that insofar as we have that infrastructure in place already, all you would need to do to have a digital dollar right now that's administered by the Treasury Department, sort of in the way that the greenback was administered by Treasury in the 1860s and after, is simply convert Treasury Direct accounts into digital wallets and then basically make one of those Treasury securities that you can purchase right now into legal tender so that you could actually spend it as a dollar. If you did that, it would be a digital dollar. And then if you can add peer-to-peer connectivity between individuals' wallets, right, so that it's not just the case that you, Scott, and I, Bob, can transact with Treasury, but now you, Scott, and I, Bob, can transact with each other as well.
Yeah, right.
And that's a complete peer-to-peer digital dollar system. And that's why this first, the original version of it, I called it the Treasury Dollar Act. And we have a kind of digital greenback that would be the digital equivalent of what we did back in the late 19th century and up into the early 20th century. So that would be stage two for us, right? So then the next question, I guess, is, well, should we move to a stage three at some point that's the equivalent of the paper dollar bill that's administered by the Fed? Should there be a Fed digital dollar? I think the answer there is a little bit less clear than it apparently seemed to be to people 100 years ago in connection with the paper dollar. And this is where we get to the Jekyll Island troubles or problems, right? So first of all, it's not clear to me that the Treasury can't manage an elastic currency in the way that it couldn't do. The Treasury is much more sophisticated than it is, and plus the technologies that the Treasury is able to use are more sophisticated. So first of all, it might be the case that the Treasury actually could manage an elastic currency, and we wouldn't need a separate central bank to do that. But secondly, let's assume even if we do say that for whatever reason we want to do it through the Fed, we still have two other problems, at least at the moment. The first is that the Fed doesn't have anything like the institutional infrastructure or the digital infrastructure, for that matter, that the Treasury has. In other words, the Fed would take a long time to be able to kind of build up to a digital dollar, whereas the Treasury could do it within a couple of weeks, believe it or not.
Well, and that meant that I had one question that I wanted you just raised in my head. What about how does the Fed now faster payment system?
Yeah,
that they started that group maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But do you feel like that they have not really made any progress fast enough to be able to accommodate what you're talking about?
Yeah, God, I'm so glad you brought that up, Scott, because I'd forgotten. That's right on point here. Yeah, I mean, in a way, the story of Fed now is kind of emblematic of the problem. And actually, two ways I think it's emblematic of the problem with thinking of this Fed function. So the first is exactly the one that you just identified. It's just taking them forever. They're just unbelievably slow with this. And it was about, I want to say it was this time last year. It was sometime around May of 2019 that they announced that they were going to speed up the effort. Now we're going to move faster. But then they announced just a couple of weeks ago that, oh, it's slowing down again. Maybe in a few years it'll be ready. So
Right.
they're just not. They don't seem. They're not very nimble, right? In the way that the Treasury could be, in theory, a lot faster. The second problem with it is that FedNow, as the Fed itself is looking at it, is just a way of speeding up interbank payments. And what right? So the hope is that that'll trickle down to you and me, right? So if I want to make a transaction, if you and I are going to transact, let's say, and let's say you bank with Bank of America, and let's say I bank with Chase up here in New York, if I have to make a payment to you, it might take a couple days for your bank to sort of verify that my payment to it, or I'm sorry, that my bank's payment to it has cleared. Basically,
Right.
it has all the steps, right? So my payment out of, first of all, Chase has to verify that I'm good for the money. Then
Right.
Chase has to tell Bank of America that Chase
Right.
it's good for the money. And then, of course, Bank of America can then tell you, yes, they're both good for the money, so now your account can be used. And that's where
And the initial bank, if I understand it correctly, has to pre-fund it. So that's why they've got to have these nostro vostro tied up dormant capital.
Exactly, which is very wasteful, right? I mean, ideally, you want capital to be circulating. That's where that velocity of money idea and the velocity of capital idea comes into play. It's a prerequisite to optimal economic growth. So the thing about it then is that FedNow, even if they could do it tomorrow, it would speed up some of your and my transactions insofar as they were interbank transactions ultimately. But the two problems are, first, the one that you just mentioned. It basically sort of ties up capital that could otherwise be being put to good use. And of course, the second problem is that if you and I don't happen to have bank accounts, if we are among the so-called unbanked or underbanked, it's no good either. Right? And as we know from all of the empirical data from the FDIC, which kind of tracks this stuff, 75% of Americans are adequately banked, 25% are either unbanked or underbanked. And what's sort of, and so that means, a quarter of our population would not have any benefit at all from FedNow in the way that they would with the digital dollar. Here's the interesting thing, or another interesting thing in this connection. Although we only have 75% bank penetration of our population, we have 95% smartphone or smart device penetration. Right. So if you and I could transact through digital wallets on our phones or other devices, 95% of America would be just like you and me. Whereas currently, if we do it through banks alone, only 75% of America is like you or me. So I think that's the other flaw with FedNow. So
and just a little plug for Ripple and XRP. If we could transact on RippleNet and use XRP as the bridge asset, we would take our transaction fees down significantly, where we wouldn't be paying these 3.5% transaction fees. So let's do away with SWIFT and bring on ODL.
Exactly. There you go. That's the other thing is, right, if you do this through Treasury, basically whether you did it through Fed or Treasury, you could do something I'm about to mention. But if you did it through Treasury, you could do it really quickly, again, by this summer. And that is that you can build this in a way that is compatible with the rails that exist in the crypto space already. And you can even, say, okay, look, we're going to make it especially compatible with the most efficient such rails, right? And so if Ripple is the best system out there, it's easy enough to make this interoperable, to go back to that word. Interoperability is easier to kind of code into a system now than it seems to have been to code into the paper currency system of the 19th century, which is another advantage, because what that means in turn then is you can continue to kind of enjoy the innovation gains that come from a vigorous and lively private sector in the digital space, while at the same time having a nationally provided public utility in the form of a universally usable currency. That
Okay, so that brings up two questions in my mind. All right, I understand the complete need to be able to not only in the United States bring along the unbanked, but what about globally? And then so that you can comment on that. And then the other thing, Bob, is if we are not going to go quick enough, are the Chinese or BRICS? I'm sure you're familiar with Brazil, Russia,
yeah.
China, Indonesia. That I don't know if they're going to wait for us in the United States to go ahead and catch up and say, hey, we've got to do something.
Yeah, great. Once again, I mean, just really spot on questions, Scott. Thanks. Let me start with the second one first, just because it's really big and extremely, quite salient right now. Quite relevant and on people's minds. So you're right. I believe. I don't think China's gonna wait, and I don't think that the BRICS are gonna wait. I don't think anybody's gonna wait for us to sort of, come to Jesus. Right? They're all gonna go first if they can. And I think that in a way, that's sort of part of their mindset. It's as you know from the op-ed up on Twitter a couple days ago that I published in the Hill the other day. China has a national strategy to be first with digital currency, to be right, and to be the global number one in digital technology.
Yeah.
And they're even trying to display as the sort of primary supplier of the global platform on which all the experimenting is done, all the information is shared. They basically want that to be their information highway. And of course, they'll start by giving everybody open access and welcome everybody, until they can, so that they can milk as many secrets or as much sort of tech savvy out of everybody else as possible.
Right.
But then once people are dependent on their global network, they can start charging people fees to access it, or they can just keep people out of it, or you name it. So we probably don't want to give away kind of global leadership in that territory, in that space, to China or any other rival for that matter. We might not want to do that. We might not want to have that ourselves either, in the sense that we might be more interested in a free flowing information environment globally. That's sort of part of our national ethos, is a sort of free exchange of information. But the only way to make sure that that happens is to make sure that we're able essentially to provide a global communications infrastructure and tech sharing infrastructure that we ourselves can keep open and not be dominated then or excluded from anything that emerges as a kind of preeminent global mechanism for these kinds of developments. So as a matter of sort of statecraft, you might say, and as a matter of sort of national defense policy and national security policy, we really ought to be trying to be out front on this, it seems to me, because these really are, of course, economic matters, and they do have, great economic significance, but they also have national security significance, and they have significance in that kind of space, the sort of overlap between economy and security. Because as we know, in general, the most dynamic economies tend to be associated with the strongest militaries as well, if for no other reason than that all the great military technology is developed in dynamic economies. And of course, you need great productive capacity. That, by the way, this is a quick sidebar, but if you're a bit of a buff like I am about the Second World War or any of the great wars of the 20th century, if you look at the statistics about, sort of how productive the German economy was and the Japanese economy was on the one hand, and how productive the American economy was at the same time in the late 1930s and early 40s, it's hard to imagine like what people like Hitler and Tojo could have been thinking. If they had just looked at the economic data, they would have realized there's no way that we can compete with America in a war. They're going to kick our butts if they just mobilize.
Right.
Because basically we produced more tanks, more bombers, more planes, more howitzers, more everything than the rest of every other country in the war combined. That is just how massively productive we were. And that productivity, of course, was rooted in our technological prowess and in our organizational prowess. And all of that was stuff that grew out of our economic arrangements. So, your economy has a real important national security significance. Any nation's economy does. And so even when we're not talking specifically about defense matters, even when we're just talking about economic matters, we shouldn't be giving away number one status to a rival, because that number one economic status always ends up becoming number one military status as well. On your first question about the lesser developed countries, here too, there's something really interesting going on, I find, and you're probably more keyed into this or more clued in than I am. But a lot of countries that are starting from lesser developed status are sort of saying, when they're as they try to basically modernize their economies, which then requires them to come up with a modern money system. They're saying, should we just go through every step that the West or that the developed world went through on the way to becoming developed? Why don't we just leapfrog to current state-of-the-art technology? And what that means is that they're not like building a bunch of brick and mortar banks all over the place, or going having their own period with a Pony Express or something before they get to sort of modern infrastructure and the like. They're just leapfrogging straight to digital. So probably the best known example of this is Ethiopia's M-Pesa system, but some of the South American countries are now developing their own versions or variations on M-Pesa as well. And basically, as you know, this is just a digital currency system that may enable people to make payments through their mobile phones, because here too, right? I mean, large portions of even underdeveloped countries' populations have mobile phones and smart devices, but don't have they don't have the wherewithal to build brick and mortar banks on every street corner. So I think that in a weird sort of ironical, even kind of paradoxical sort of way, we have the potential now to have a kind of an integrated global payment system that includes even the underdeveloped countries, right? Doesn't leave them out as kind of marginalized. And that ultimately could be very good for them and for us, because then we can benefit by the capacity to have commerce with those countries that previously would have been outliers, and they can have the benefit of commerce with us. And you could have a much better integrated, in the good ways, global economy.
And I don't want to come across as just an XRP and Ripple homer, right? But again, as you were saying that, what was coming into my head, Bob, was yeah, but we can't do that with SWIFT, because the transaction fees on the lower micro payments are not going to allow these unbanked and underdeveloped countries to be able to participate. And I get that if we go mobile and digital, I get it, okay. But if we don't get micro payments enabled, then those people are not going to have a bank. They're not going to be able to participate because they don't have enough money to spend, because it's getting eaten up too much with the fees that SWIFT takes. Is that accurate?
I agree. I fully agree. Yeah, I think that's spot on, Scott. I think that's exactly accurate. It is. What am I thinking? It's sort of, there's an irony here, right? Because it's often, people will often complain about the fact that our payment system is dependent on private sector banks, because they say the banks are middlemen and they oftentimes will take a fee. We all experience it when we use ATMs that aren't from our own bank, of course. And people complain about that, and rightly so, in my view. But SWIFT takes a lot more than a $3 fee. So it's a middleman too, right?
And again, plus the settlement time. It's not just costly, and then the cherry on top, which I'm not sure. I think a lot of the people in the XRP community understand this, but I know that Joe Public has no clue that SWIFT carries with it a 6% error rate. And I got news for you, Bob. I make 100 phone calls, and this thing fails 6 times. I'm getting me a new phone.
That's the problem. Yeah, exactly. If you had 6 failures out of 100 calls, that's just an unacceptable rate, right? I mean, that's actually a massive, by all the standards of all other industries, that's just a massive fail rate, right? I mean, in most industries, we speak in terms of hundredths of 1%, right? We speak in terms of, that is to say, of basis points. And when you talk about, you know, a 6% failure rate, we're talking 600 basis points, as it were, not, you know, 2 or 3 basis points. And that's just, you know, no industry would tolerate that, right? No private sector industry would put up with that kind of rate.
So right now, in my understanding of the development of the cryptocurrency being adopted in the U.S., the biggest thing is that I've understood is that the regulations are what we're waiting on now. I feel like that I've seen great progress, but again, you're more on the inside of this than I am. But what is your feel for going, if we will travel back to October and our Maxine Waters is saying that she just doesn't understand Bitcom? And now we fast forward to now when we've got 32 bills that are supposedly in Congress now. Do you feel like that also the beer cold is what I call the existing health problem that we have, because YouTube likes to kick videos off if you say the C word? So the beer cold, the economic chokehold that is put on the world now, do you feel like that is giving enough incentive for the American politicians to go ahead and start acting with some urgency?
I think I have to say that my optimism with respect to that question has been kind of waxing and waning. It's been a little bit cyclical. I won't call it volatile because it's never been extreme optimism or extreme pessimism, but it is varying a little, and I'll tell you why. So ever since the pandemic became an obviously ominous thing in the sense that we started sort of shutting down temporarily, there's been a lot more talk in Congress about moving more quickly to some kind of digital dollar. And that is, at least initially, a kind of that gives you a sort of an initial cause for optimism. Then to make things even more inspiring or sort of hope fulfilling, or to say put a cherry on top of it, to use your metaphor. What was even better news was that it was bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans alike seemed to be thinking, yeah, let's get a move on here. And then the sort of crowning glory of all was the fact that both Democratic Congress members and Republican Congress members were willing to speak with me, or at least to have their staffers speak with me, Paige, or at least to see if I could figure out whether there might be a way through communicating with one another all to get ourselves onto the same page. Right. And I was really struck by the fact that when I was talking to Republican Congress members, staffers on the one hand, or Democratic Congress members, staffers on the other hand, they all basically seem to view this the same way. There seem to be no particular disagreements. There might have been slight differences in emphases, like a Democratic staffer might be more excited about banking the unbanked, and a little less excited, although still somewhat excited, about the prospect of, sort of not losing the competition to China or what have you. And then a Republican Congress member might be a little bit more exercised by the competition with China, but still, to his or her credit, would say, yeah, this doesn't make sense to have people unbanked. So they were both on board with the same reasons. And they all seemed to be also intrigued by the Treasury possibility as well, because they admitted they hadn't thought of that. And that's, again, because monetary history is kind of obscure. People just don't tend to know what the history of our money is. But as soon as you tell them that, yeah, the greenback, blah, 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 then they think, oh, yeah, I guess we could do that again. So I was quite optimistic, starting about, I would say, by early April at some point. And I'm still optimistic now. In fact, I had a great call, very encouraging call with a Republican congressman staffer just before you and I got on. Actually, remember, I texted you or whatever. I forgot I had a 2 o'clock. That was what it was. It was with a Southern Republican Congress member's staffer. So I remain optimistic. But here's the one sense in which the optimism is a little bit more tempered now than maybe it was a month or a month and a half ago. It's that, to some extent, the conversation in Washington having to do with the pandemic seems to be moving a little off of digital currency again now and focusing more on reopening schedules and things like that. And I get that. I understand why that has to happen because, yeah, we don't want to be shut down forever. And even if we don't reopen right away, we should at least be talking about how, when we will reopen and how we get there, right? We need to be talking about it. So I get it. I understand that that's sort of more at the top of or sort of more on the front burner now for those guys. But and that has me a little bit worried then that the digital dollar discussion has been sort of put not on the back burner exactly, but it's got like sort of it's space number 2 or place number 2 or 3 in the queue. You know what I mean?
Well, Bob. Okay, so Bob. Okay, my understanding is the first stimulus that went through was around, I think, around $3 trillion, 2 or 3. 3.
I want to say it was 2.3. Does that sound right?
And then if we divide that, I've heard this from a couple of different people that if you divide it by the number of Americans, that it was around $16,500 per citizen if you broke it down that way.
Yeah. It's actually on one breakdown it's worse, and in one it's slightly better. If you count Fed money with Treasury money, it's $36,000 per capita.
Okay.
If you take the Fed stuff out because it's loans that have to be paid back and look only at Treasury, which are grants, then it's $14,400. Which
okay.
Is
so
yeah.
you have a much better kind of an understanding of it than me. Okay, so I'm average Joe Public out here.
Yeah.
Today I checked my bank account and I was over the moon. I got my $1,200 payment today.
Yeah.
But Bob, today is May 14th.
Yep. And the CARES Act was passed, I think, on March 23rd or something.
I just got it today.
Almost 2 months, right?
And it was deposited into my bank.
Yeah.
I didn't get a paper check.
Yeah.
So how can Mr. Mnuchin understand that something like that is happening and not feel like, guys, we got to be able to do better than this?
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, that's the thing. It seems to me that, this highlights the urgency of the matter, right? If you think about the fact that, like you said, you received yours in the form of direct deposit, and it took today, right? Almost 2 months. And those who are going to receive paper checks, first of all, it's going to take even longer because apparently Donald Trump insists on signing them himself, which is a bit of a holdup. And then, but then even after that, they'll have to take them if they're not banked, they'll have to take them to check cashing services, which always take a big chunk, right? So they'll lose more. And then to top salt, let's say, paper is a notorious vector of virus, so it's not even a very safe mode of transmission. You might have read this, like in February, China began literally laundering its paper money because people were getting the virus from their currency.
I saw that. Yeah. Yep.
Right. So yeah, I think Mr. Mnuchin ought to be really troubled about this and ought to be really gung ho about going digital for this, because then you could get it to everybody immediately.
Well,
there would be.
But the nefarious part of that, the negative that some people feel about that, Bob, is that they're trying to take us into a cashless society so they can then check our social behavior, and then if we're not being good Joe Public and Mary Public, that they can cut us off. If they can, have us all controlled monetarily, cashless and digital, then if we don't follow with the behavior that they want us to do, then they'll cut us off from that. And then the other thing, do you believe that the entire direction of the planet is that that the powers that be, who's ever pulling the strings, do want to take us to a cashless society?
That's a good question. So I guess a couple of thoughts there, maybe, Scott. So first of all, I agree with you that it's a real worry, right? I mean, the potential for abuse of something of this sort is immense, and we wouldn't. I mean, we just can't tolerate it, right? We can't let that happen. And that then invites the question: so, what are the best safeguards, or what are the best means of sort of preventing that from happening? The worst case scenario that you can imagine is basically, again, China, where they have that social credit system that we talked about, where you get
Right.
demerits even if you're not nice to somebody, and then that can restrict your travel and all sorts of other things. And it'd be very easy, essentially, to start assigning us social credit scores over some sort of centralized system like this, and you might be inviting, essentially, big brotherism and 1984 and all of that. So yeah, we definitely have to figure out how to prevent that. And then when it comes to hopeful, so a somewhat less hopeful strategy seems to have been adopted by Sweden. What Sweden is doing, as you probably know, the Riksbank, which is their central bank, has started the e-krona project, and they're in a test phase right now. They basically went live with their trial starting February 28th, I believe. And what they want to do is they're going to say basically any transaction below a certain threshold amount is just automatically anonymized, right? There's basically no information tabulated, nothing that anybody can kind of track down. It's all basically fully encrypted is the idea. So that basically it would replicate paper cash or dollar, silver coin cash or what have you, up to the threshold amount. And then when the threshold amount would basically be already that whatever is named by bank secrecy laws that we already have that require banks to report transactions over a certain amount for fear that it might then be terrorist financing. So apparently, I guess Osama bin Laden would have sent money to people in like $20,000 chunks or whatever. And so the Treasury banks are required to report transactions of that size so that then Treasury can kind of investigate and make sure it's not terrorist finance. So essentially what Sweden has decided to do is, okay, we're going to make our cryptocurrency fully encrypted up to that threshold amount.
Right.
You can call it the bin Laden amount. And then when you pass the bin Laden amount, then the ordinary bank secrecy laws kick in. Now, on the one hand, that sounds really, really promising.
Yeah.
My one concern about it is I just don't know how utterly safe it is against possible bad faith actors in future, right?
Right.
The Swedish government doesn't seem to be a big brother sort of government. Sweden doesn't seem ever to have had a big brother sort of government. But, anything can happen, right? Probably nobody ever thought that Hungary would have a big brother president after the communist era, but now they have.
Right.
So I don't know to what extent I feel safe just because we're told that it's encrypted up to a certain amount, because if there's any way to de-encrypt it or to sort of change the policy midstream, if we have a bad faith actor who's the president or the Treasury Secretary, I might be a little bit worried. I'm not paranoid. I'm still generally optimistic, but it seems like it's at least a possible abuse. So the other possibility, I suppose, would be then to say, okay, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we say that private sector crypto will be allowed just to continue as it is, as a possible alternative, right? So that you and I, if we wanted to, we could transact in Ripple, or we could transact even in pack coins if we wanted to. If we really like
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, we like Manny.
yeah, and that would be sort of the equivalent, I suppose, of still having paper money. In the event that I think all of us, you probably do this. When I have a little bit of extra cash, I'll oftentimes just squirrel it away in a drawer or something, so that way, if there were like a temporary power outage or something, and I couldn't make payments with my phone or with a card, or I couldn't withdraw money from the bank, I've got a little bit of a cash reserve that I can kind of I can live off of for a little while until such time as the power comes back. And I think the same thing would go here. You could say, well, we might retain Ripple and other sort of private sector or privately issued such currencies as fallbacks that we can always use with one another in the event either that the national system had a crash of some sort, or somehow fell into the hands of an abusive president who didn't take his constitutional or her constitutional limitations seriously. That might be a better way. I actually, it's sort of not an either or, right? You could say Sweden plus Ripple as a sort of shorthand, or let's say Sweden plus Pacquiao, because you could still have the Swedish system and say we're going to encrypt it up to that amount, but also we don't want to rely entirely on that. So we're also going to keep Patcoin and Ripple and everything else as a kind of, again, a fallback in the event that anything goes wrong with the national system.
Well, Bob, do you have any feel at all? I'm going to go into the tin hat area here just a little bit. Do you feel like that that the one world order and one world currency, that who is there a group of people, whether it be the Bilderberg group or whoever is out there trying to move us into a one world currency so they can track everybody, and AI is going to have cameras everywhere? And do you have any fear that we're heading in that direction?
I have a very pronounced fear that we could get there. In other words, I don't have a feeling one way or the other as to whether we're heading there, because I just don't know whether anybody has that intention or any group of people has that intention. But I do believe this. I believe, A, that groups of people could have that intention. It's certainly not it's not a logical impossibility. And indeed, given what we know about human nature as manifest through history, it would actually be surprising if there weren't anybody thinking along
Right.
these lines, right? There have to be power-hungry people out there who are thinking exactly along these lines. So that's the first cause of concern for me. And then the second one is that whereas 50 or 100 years ago, those kind of power mad people would basically just have to fantasize. They couldn't really do anything about it unless they were Napoleon and they could, basically get millions of people to follow them. It's becoming easier, technologically speaking, or more feasible, at least technologically speaking, to do that. So if human nature has not changed so that there still is a certain number of Hitlers or Stalins born every year or every decade on the one hand, and then at the same time, the technology is proceeding rapidly enough that it now might be possible for people like that to get their hands on technologies that would enable them essentially to exercise forms of domination that previously they couldn't, again, unless they could somehow win the German election in 1932. Then there's a serious possible danger, right? It's sort of a counterpart to, there's an analog to this in other spaces. So people sometimes note that it's getting easier and easier, or at least less and less difficult to build a nuclear weapon, right? We might have a day come where little terrorist cells can build, small nuclear weapons in their basements or something, and blow up entire cities, and then that's like game changing, right? How do we live safe? Right. If people ever have that wherewithal? And there, you note that in that scenario, the people who do this in the basement are no different than other evil people before them. We've always had them, probably always will. But the difference is suddenly there's this new technical capacity that didn't exist before. Genghis Khan could not blow up the world. He just didn't have the technology. They just had bows and horses, But if today's Genghis Khans are able to, build nuclear weapons in basements, that could be a problem. And sort of similarly then in the crypto space or in the currency space, if you got to a point where little, various Genghis Khans or Napoleons or Hitlers or Stalins could, basically master technologies that enable them to kind of take over, even if only temporarily, our money system or track our data so as to sort of know everything about us simply because we had the gall to make payments to one another through our phones. That sucks. If I can use a technical term, if I can use the academic word for that, as we say, that sucks. Or that would suck.
All right, so
rather not get there,
One thing I wanted to ask your indulgence really quickly. I had a couple of people that had given me some questions, and I'd like number one, I would love to ask you if you would consider doing this again with me, because this has been absolutely fascinating, and I feel like that I've learned a lot more. And I grew up, my mother, I told you before, was an English professor, and I grew up in a college environment. We lived in a little place called Banner Elk, North Carolina.
Uh-huh.
Lees McRae College was where we grew up, and then I went there, and then I transferred after that and went to Appalachian State University. So not exactly Ivy League, but I was happy. I
it's
was
a
happy
great.
I made it through.
Well, no, you've got like North Carolina has an education system, including higher ed, that's kind of the envy of the country. It's one of the greatest. You probably already knew this, but I can certainly report that the word up here in New York is always that North Carolina has one of the greatest higher education systems in the country.
Well,
so if your mom was teaching in it and you were living in it, then you got it. You got it going on.
And I'm a lifelong diehard Tar Heel basketball fan. So we've got great basketball and tremendous barbecue. Not to slight the Texans, but we got good barbecue here. But but my roundabout way of getting back to that was that I would love. I don't feel like I had enough time to be able to ask everything that I wanted to, so I would love to do this again. But I did want, if it's okay with you, to give you a couple of rapid fire questions and get some response from these, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. Let me answer your first one there first, and then we can go to the others. So yeah, anytime, Scott. This has been an honor for me. I've learned a ton as well, and let's just keep talking like this. Let's do a lot more of this.
I would love to do that. Okay, so here's the first one. This is from one of my favorite women in the crypto XRP world. She lives in Japan. It's Crypto Airy. She's got a couple of questions, Bob. One is, who is going to administer the Treasury Direct wallets?
Oh, good. So there are a number of different possibilities there. One would be to house that in the OCC again, right? The OCC, or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, was exactly that department within Treasury that administered the greenback. And so there would be a certain kind of historical satisfaction, I think, that might come of housing it in that department. But even if we didn't, we might even just establish a new department within Treasury to do it as well, if we needed to, at least. The OCC, of course, was brand new when we started it up. Treasury has existed ever since basically since the George Washington administration. OCC was a new office within Treasury when we created it in the mid-1860s. So we could always create a new thing too, but I would be tempted to sort of at least look into the possibility of maybe housing it in the OCC, just because that would be sort of weirdly historically satisfying, since we're going back to the greenback.
And Bob, I believe his name is Brian Brooks. Isn't he the one who's the new comptroller? And he came from Coinbase.
Yep. And that's a good sign too, because before him, the last one that I used to have a lot of dealings with was Julie Williams, who left, I think, around 2012, 2013. And I used to work at the Fed in the New York Fed in those days. And, she would fine person, but in many ways, but she wouldn't have done a Bitcoin from a bit part, maybe.
But Judy Shelton does.
Yes.
Okay. The second question from Crypto Area is, what about people who are not banked? It is a very big number in the U.S. Unbanked is 10% plus. Underbanked is 15%. For example, currently the paper check can be cashed at Check Cashing Money Changer business, which over 1 million low-income people in the U.S. are in that group. So I know we covered this a little bit before, but that was a question that she had. So you want to mention that again?
Yeah, definitely. So that's right out of my playbook. As we were talking about before, she's probably referring to the very same statistics that I was, because remember I said 25% were either unbanked or underbanked. That's the FDIC data tells us that. And what that means is a number of things, but one thing it means is there's the check cashing problem, as she mentions in her question. It also, of course, is one of the reasons that FedNow is not a particularly promising thing, even if it happens, as we also talked about. And so from my point of view, because 95% of Americans do have at least some kind of smart device, even while only 75% have bank accounts, if we did this through Treasury Direct, and if we converted the Treasury Direct accounts, or TDAs as I call them, into Treasury Direct wallets, then, and again, if we then made those wallets P2P or sort of horizontally interactive or interoperable, that just would be a currency system. That would be a digital dollar that we could all use off of our phones, whether we had banks or not. So I think that would be a kind of an ideal solution to that particular problem. And indeed, that particular problem is one of the things that motivates me to do this in the first place.
Gotcha. Okay, now this is from a gentleman who calls himself Ripple Bobby XRP.
Excellent. That's a great credential. We know
remember Talladega Nights. Remember Talladega Nights, Ricky Bobby. So this is a friend of mine from California, Ripple Bobby, and he's asking, Bob, is it possible Ripple and Stellar are secretly in cahoots with each other, being that XLP is a deflationary coin and XLM is an inflationary coin? Do you feel like that they could be used in conjunction for a hybrid economy, or do you think that would they're trying to avoid antitrust laws, or both?
Well, that's a good question. I'd have to read a little bit more before I would feel confident about attributing motives. It's hard for me to guess, given my current knowledge base, at least what the motives might be, right? Why they might be doing what they're doing. But when it comes to what their possible motives might be, or what might prompt somebody to do that, I think that's a perfectly sound and plausible question, right? I mean, that would certainly be something to look for, because it would be one possibility. I think in general, oftentimes if there's some measure that some person or group of people are planning on taking, it's oftentimes pretty easy to imagine an above-board motive for it and a below-board motive for it. And I generally, this is sort of just an interpretive rule that I usually follow in life. I usually tend to believe in the above-board motive until it becomes no longer possible to believe it, right? I mean, I think in some fields of study, people refer to this as charitable interpretation. Basically you just sort of assume the best as far as people's motives are concerned, until it's no longer possible to believe that, right? When they punch you in the face one time and they say it was an accident, maybe it was. But if it happens a second or third time, probably not. And so I think I would watch this particular case, and I'll do a little bit more reading on it. But at present, I don't see any reason to assume the worst. I'll put it that way.
Well, what they call that in down here in North Carolina is cockeyed optimism.
There we go. It's funny. I just called myself that to somebody today, remembering it from my Louisiana days.
Yeah. All right. So now we got two more people that wanted to ask you something really quick. Okay. And I'm sure the next time we get together, I'll have some more. Yeah, all right. But this is a good friend of mine named David, and he's known in our XRP community as Cryptopolis.
Oh, good.
So David asks, ask him if he thinks that J. Christopher Giancarlo is the right guy to get the digital dollar initiative to the goal line and acted upon by Congress.
What a great question. So I'm actually, believe it or not, working with Chris on this. So maybe needless to say, on that basis, I think Chris is a very important figure here to make this happen. I think Chris is a little bit less hurried than I am, to be frank. I think Chris, in general, I guess, I'm not sort of revealing anything that he himself has said. So please take this as a sort of interpretation on my part, rather than a definitive statement of actual intention or desire about him. But my impression of Chris in general is that he wants to get this right from the very get-go. And so he wants to give as much time and attention to getting every detail right as he possibly can, which is a beautiful thing. America is full of, especially in recent years, we've got lots of stories of things being done in a slapdash way because people were in a hurry. And as we know, as our own moms and grandmoms probably told us, slow and steady often can win the race. But in that respect, I think Chris and I have a slightly different sort of intellectual style, maybe, or maybe even just different metabolism or something, because my own thought is that I want to sever the question of the optimal system from the immediately feasible system, if it's possible to do that at least. And if it's possible then to put something in place that's at least workable and not going to screw everything up quickly, and then optimize it afterwards over time and take your time to optimize it, that seems to me to be the optimal way to go. And that's actually one reason that I have been pushing the Treasury version of this, precisely because you can do it in a very bare bones way with no frills. It's almost like, you remember when you and I were kids or in teenagers, if you're going to buy a car, the standard model would come with just a stick shift, and a clutch. No automatic, and then probably no radio, maybe an AM radio, but no FM, and just basically just no frills and, kind of hand cranked windows. And then you could always add features if you wanted. If you had more money, you could, get an automatic transmission, or you could get your full stereo and so forth. I tend to think that I think of what Chris is looking for as the sort of all features are there, all the bells and whistles are present. And I'm thinking much more in terms of that standard model, the lost leader, so to speak, model that you or I might have purchased when we were teenagers, when we got our first car. And I don't think it has to be an either or. Now, I could be wrong about that, but my own view, for what it's worth, is that we could start with the standard model now, so that stimulus checks and so forth aren't, taking forever to get to people.
Not 2 months for Scott here.
Yeah.
We go to round 2. Let's get it here quicker than 60 days.
Well, exactly right. And then once we have that up and running, it's easy enough, it seems to me, to take as much time as we need to get the final version right. And the final version might very well be at the Fed. I believe that Chris would rather see it at the Fed. I'm agnostic about that. I think the final version might be best at the Fed, but the final version might be best just kept in Treasury as well. All I know is that, I'm kind of, again, agnostic about as between Treasury and Fed for the future. But for now, for the immediate version, the standard model,
at the Treasury.
I think that's Treasury. Yeah.
Right.
But I think it's great that Chris is part of this, and he has great credibility. So I'm very honored to be on the same team with him.
Well, I'm glad that David will be very pleased with that answer. Okay, now my last person that wanted to ask a question, and the next time we get together, I'm sure I'm going to have more of these from different people, but this is from a guy that I consider to be a friend of mine. He's actually the first person that we ever interviewed on XRP Army News.
Oh, great.
And I love Brad Kimes, and I'm deeply indebted to him. So Brad wanted me to ask you, does he think that the Treasury will create and release a new dollar equal to Fed dollar? And then his second question is, if so, will it take us to a transition to the digital dollar and digital wallet? And then 3, do you think the bond market is in trouble? If yes, how do you think they restore confidence in the bond market without going to a digital tokenized system to restore confidence and take advantage of the velocity of money? And he said to tell him I said hello, and it was a great article.
Oh, how sweet. Oh, thanks so much. Well, first, thank you. Thanks so much for that. I'm really, truly honored. And then on the questions themselves, I'll start with the sort of the easy one first on the whether Treasury could issue a dollar that was equally valued to the Fed Reserve note. The short answer is, or even the glib answer is, I certainly hope so, because that's exactly what I'm pushing. And then the slightly longer answer is, yes, it is possible. And the one reason I'm pushing it, or at least one prerequisite, you might say, that would have had to have been met before I would feel like pushing it, because I never push stuff that I think is just utopian, is that it's possible. As sort of an interesting data point here that all of your viewers might actually find halfway interesting is that there are a lot of Treasury dollars, so to speak, that are still out there, and they're still legal tender. And so they basically trade, at par with the dollar bill. Indeed, this silver certificate that I showed you before, this is a 1957 issuance. So this was a dollar in 1957, And it was, of course, as you know, there were Federal Reserve note dollars in 1957 too. In fact, I could still spend this now. I wouldn't be breaking the law. It's still legal tender. The reason you don't tend to see these things is probably the same reason you don't see $2 bills very often. It's that they're so unusual that when people get them, they don't spend them. They just keep them because they're kind of cool. An equivalent, if you got like change in your hand and you saw an old buffalo nickel,
Yeah.
you really save it. Yeah, you wouldn't just go and spend it on a gumball in a gumball machine, right? So I think it's because it's sort of rare now, and therefore kind of it's a curiosity. People sort of save these things rather than spending them, but they're still money. And so there's and again, the fact that it says $1 and looks just like a Federal Reserve note dollar bill kind of tells you everything you need to know. It's just the same thing. It simply happens to be issued by a different federal authority, but both are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States on equal terms, and so they're basically one and the same. So it's possible, and I think at this point I'm thinking it's probable, and it's certainly something that I want to happen and I'm trying to make happen. On the bond market, that's a really great question, really big question too, and I have to say I'm very puzzled at this point as to what seems most likely to happen. There seem to be an unusual number of imponderables at work right now out there in the economy, all of which would bear upon the expected value right now of any particular bond instrument or corporate equity for that matter. And the more such imponderables there are, the more difficult it becomes to sort of extrapolate or sort of predict sort of what the future value of various instruments will be. And indeed, you're seeing that to some extent reflected in the futures market, right? The market where people actually are, in effect, placing bets on the expected future values of various financial instruments. Futures markets are a bit over the map, kind of all over the map. And that, I think, just reflects the fact that people are a little unclear as to what might happen. It's just to say basically that we're kind of radically uncertain at this point about a number of different things, any one of which could be important, right? So just to take a couple of examples, think about the pandemic, the various possible paths from here that might occur, right? One possibility is that the thing just sort of dies out over the summer, never comes back. We're good. It was a terrible couple of months, but everything's back to normal. But that's one possibility. Another possibility is that we sort of repeat the history of the 1918-1919 Spanish flu pandemic, which, as you know, killed 50 million people worldwide. So far,
Right.
COVID, the current pandemic doesn't even come close to that. But the thing that was really, really killer about that one, really, really insidious about it, was that just when we thought we had beaten it, just when the death rates began to drop, it suddenly came back in the autumn, and the second wave was much worse than the first.
Right.
So that just, that's another possibility with this one, right? And there's no way, it seems, to tell which of these two things might happen. And so that makes it pretty hard to kind of bake in or cook in an expected value of a bond instrument of any kind that's associated with an issuer that might be affected by the pandemic, right? The other thing that it seems to me that's worth sort of noting in this connection is the various different political scenarios you can imagine, right? Because there are a lot of different possible political responses to the pandemic. It's like such a weird, different time that I think the politics are going to be weird and different too, right? I mean, you're going to hear crazy ideas suggested. That never would have been, old ideas sort of resurrected. And then finally, another possibility, it's sort of interesting to me. I mean, this is another reason I'm still a cockeyed optimist, is, there was a particular decade. So first of all, that Spanish flu, again, of about a little over 100 years ago, was much worse than COVID. But then there was a decade that came after it that we have a name for. It was the something 20s. What do we call the 20s? Roaring.
That's it. Roaring. Yeah. I was going to say grand. The Roaring 20s.
Yeah, Roaring 20s. That was a period of just immense economic growth. I mean, it was a really, people just sort of went crazy with purchasing and optimistic, sort of drinking and spending and fun having. I mean, in a certain sense, the Great Depression, it's really weird. This is sort of a sidebar thing. We could talk about this on another occasion, but I have this theory that the 1920s were the beginning of the 1960s. And then it got postponed by the market crash of 1929. Because if you look at the stuff that people were doing by like 1927 or 28, makes me blush. I mean, these people were like, they were doing stuff that the hippies would have been shocked by, and so I sometimes think, the market crash of 29 basically delayed the 60s by about 30 years. It was a wild time, and that was following the worst pandemic in recorded human history, other than the bubonic plague. So, that tells me that the 2020s could also end up becoming a roaring 20s as well once we're through this. And if you think about it, if that were to happen, then a lot of bonds right now that are out there issued by companies that might survive into a next roaring 20s would presumably go up in value, or at least the confidence that people could have in them would rise, and corporate equities would presumably go through the roof, right? But we just, again, at this point, it's so hard to know, or even to develop a probabilistic judgment as to what might happen. There's the old, the old difference between so the great British economist Maynard Keynes and his contemporary, the great American economist Frank Knight, who, by the way, was here at Cornell, both around the same time in basically the early 1920s, they introduced a distinction into the economic literature between risk and uncertainty. Risk is, and the best analogy is like with a pair of dice. So if you throw a pair of dice, you don't really know what sides are going to come up, but you at least know what the possibilities are, right? There's only so many combinatoric possibilities. So risk is what you use. The term risk has to do with the likelihood of a particular pair of dice coming up, right? The likelihood of 2 6s or snake eyes or what have you. And again, you can assign probability numbers to those, even if you can't know in advance what the outcome is going to be. But now slightly change the game. Let's say instead of having determinate numbers on the sides of the dice, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 6, you were given a pair of dice and you couldn't see the numbers on them. They were covered. So it could be that one has like 1,643,000.25 on it, and another one might have, negative 63.8, and you just have no way of knowing it because it's covered up. And then you throw the dice. And then somebody says, what's the likelihood that what comes up is 8 or 8.2? You don't even know where to begin, because there's an infinite number of numbers that could be on the side of each. And plus, it's like 12 times that, right? It's that to the 12th power as far as the number of combinations. So there's literally that's not even a calculable probability. It is literally incalculable. And so in some ways it's tempting. So what Keynes and Frank Knight were talking about in the 1920s was that sometimes your economy faces a situation a bit like that game of dice that I just mentioned, where it's not just like I don't know what probability to assign to it. It's that I don't even know what the possibilities to assign the probabilities to be would be, right? Or to would be. I got it. You know what I mean? So
Bob, we've got a big mess on our hands.
Indeed, we have, my friend. We have. But maybe you and I, if we keep talking like this, we might come up with a few good ideas, at least, right?
But I agree. I mean, the problems are just, the unintended consequences. Yeah. I mean, it's just, I know a lot of people want us to go all green. Well, okay, if we stop giving Saudi Arabia a whole lot of money, is that going to all of a sudden radicalize them because they don't have any money?
Yeah, I mean, unintended consequence, right?
I mean, it's a lot of different, possibilities out there. And again, I love that where you just took me on an image trail in my own head with describing how we don't even know, we can't even know what the possibilities are. Yeah. And I got it. Yeah. Now, I'd like to end with one thing. Two things. Your reaction to the debt going from in the derivative markets to potentially $1.2 quadrillion. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that you are an Ivy Leaguer, but can I, being a kid from the mountains of North Carolina, Bob, I can't even wrap my head around 1.2 quadrillion.
Yeah, it's just it's like an insane number, and I think I've always been, when I was growing up, I was largely raised by my grandparents, and they had an old Swedish Bible in the house, and they're very old-fashioned. And I read that as a kid. I sort of entertained myself when I had free time on my hands. I'd read Bible stories. And, in those days, I would sort of, one of the things I remember being struck by was this institution of the Jubilee that the ancient Hebrews had, where it was like every 7 years they would just say, okay, let's just wipe the slates clean. I don't know if something that's exactly like the Jubilee would be doable now. It'd probably throw too many things into sort of complete chaos and disarray. But I can certainly see how it could come to pass that there might come crazy times in history when you just have to kind of wipe the slate clean, because it's just simply impossible to live with the alternative. And I think, however a quarter of a quadrillion dollars, that I don't know how anybody lives up to that obligation. And at that point, you almost begin to think that the creditors probably shouldn't have ever believed that was ever going to be payable.
And then the other thing, the other little cherry on top, right? I know when people look at the USA debt clock, they always are captivated by that $24 trillion number.
Yeah.
That's not the bad part. I want to take them down the trail to the lower right-hand corner. $147 trillion of unfunded liabilities. Thank you very much.
That's
How in the world does anybody think, Bob, that we're going to be able to pay off $170 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities?
Yeah, I don't, this is another one of those cases where, if liabilities are going to be credible, they have to be funded. Our great, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, the very first thing he did basically his first mission when he became Treasury Secretary was to consolidate the national debt, to make it, first of all, manageable and payable, and then to actually start paying it. And one of the things he did was, it was sort of a two-step process. He thought, well, all of the different states have their own independent debt because they were fighting the Revolutionary War as independent states. So he said, why don't we consolidate that, put it all on the federal balance sheet? So basically the federal government will buy the debt assume the debt. It was called assumption. It will just sort of take over the debt from the states so that they don't have to pay it. And it will put it all into one, basically one sort of liability basket, so to speak. And then he said, let's establish what we call a sinking fund, which is basically a fund that you keep putting money into and you keep sort of growing it in order to then sort of steadily to pay down that debt. And so one way of saying this then is to say he consolidated the debt and funded the debt, right? And those are the two magic words, debt consolidation and debt funding. Both of those add up to debt manageability. That's what you need to manage it, because if you don't consolidate it, it's sort of sprawling. You're not even sure that you have all of it under, you're not even sure you can keep track of all of it. So consolidating it makes it understandable because it's all in one place. And then you fund it, meaning that you provide the wherewithal to pay it down. And those two things jointly add up to managing it, right? Then you can manage it. And that's the key to finance, right? I mean, every corporation borrows a lot, right? That's what all those bond instruments are. But the ones that succeed because they manage their debt. They don't just issue it, with abandon. And so Hamilton's wisdom, I think, was essentially to understand that you need to manage a debt, and then it can be what he called the national blessing, but only if you're managing it. And to do that, you got to consolidate it and you got to fund it. And so my hackles are raised by the same thing that yours are. I see unfunded liabilities, and I think, okay, this is Hamilton without the sinking fund. That's crazy, right? Yeah, just nutty.
Yeah. So I think we can end it on that note. And again, I'd like to offer a warm invitation to come back, because there are so many more things that I'd like to be able to ask you about. And the last thing I'd like to say is my friend Brad Kimes would, after hearing what you just finished saying, he would really have a hard time if I did not mention the potential to you, Bob, of a debt jubilee.
Ah, right. Yeah. So I was sort of alluding to that in the, with that reference to the biblical institution of the Jubilee. The Jubilee, I think, is basically a good idea. And that's one of the reasons it's there in the Bible. The one thing that would be a problem now, I think, it would be if you did it literally every 7 years. financial markets would just plan around it, right?
Yes.
So you kind of need a certain unpredictability in it for it to work. And I suppose in biblical times, having a set schedule of every 7 years was workable because the technology at the time was such that you couldn't hedge around it and so forth.
Right.
But now, financial markets are so sophisticated and kind of light speed that they would hedge around it. So if you wanted it to work now, it would have to be a little bit more what they call stochastic, a little bit more unpredictable. But otherwise, I do think that there are circumstances where you really got to do that, at least in part, right? You don't, even if you don't want to go with like 100% debt forgiveness, at least partial write downs in some cases end up being ultimately, more valuable because you can't squeeze blood from a turnip. It's sort of a really interesting case, by the way. This was actually an interesting North Carolina story. Bank of America, of course, the great North Carolina bank, sort of did some experiments after the mortgage crash and crisis in 2008, 2009, where they said, okay, well, look, some of the mortgage loans in our portfolio are loans that are owed by people whose housing value has dropped below the value of the loan, right? And that's what you call a house. And so they ran some statistical tests, and they found out that the default risk of an underwater mortgage is like 70 or 80%. It's really high.
Yeah.
So if you discount the face value of the loan by the default risk, it turns out that the expected value might be, I don't know, let's say $50,000 less than the face value. So what Bank of America discovered was if they actually write down a piece of the debt so that it's no longer underwater, the expected value rose by more than the amount of the trimming. So they actually gained more. It was effectively they were cutting their losses by cutting the loan, or by cutting the debt.
But ending up making more money over the long term if it got paid off.
That's the thing. So basically,
smart thing to go. Yeah.
They were a smart bank, and they came out of it smelling like a rose as far as their balance sheet was concerned. I mean, they were one of the few banks that didn't really need serious bailout money because they managed their portfolio really intelligently in that way, and that included what you could call fractional jubilees, you might say, because they did it voluntarily. Nobody told them to do it. They just realized, hey, we're actually going to save money by cutting losses if we cut some of these debts down just enough to get the home above water again. So that if, let's say you owe $100,000 on your home, and let's say your home is dropped to $110,000 in value, but you now own, you owe $200,000. Well, if your house is worth almost just a little more than half of what you owe, you're probably not going to be able to pay it all off.
Nope.
So you might just end up abandoning it, which a lot of people do. So what Bank of America thought was, okay, well, look, if the house is worth $110,000, let's drop the debt down to $105,000. We'll cut off the rest. Now Scott has a 5% equity share in his own home. And now he wants to keep it because he's still, there's some prospect of paying the debt and of owning it outright in the future. So he's going to stick with it and pay. And that ended up basically sparing them a whole bunch of defaults. That's a lot of money. So anyway, the Jubilee idea, I think, can still work as long as it's done a little bit more kind of technologically savvily than it could be done back in Old Testament times.
Well, I think we've got to be, it's the ingenuity of the bad actors almost knows no bounds.
True.
I really loved The Big Short.
Yeah.
But I stumbled onto a video the other day. There was an interview with a gentleman named Matthew Cox. Yep. Have you run across him yet, Bob?
I have, yeah.
He was the most wanted FBI person because he was writing up mortgages.
Yep.
Oh, that was amazing.
Pretty amazing thing, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the way, the ingenuity of the bad actor, if there's a way. So no, I don't believe we could set up a schedule every 7 years.
That's the thing. That's exactly right. That's where that's why I think it has to be sort of unpredictable, because if it's predictable, they'll work around it. And my theory is always that if we want to outdo the bad actors, we have to have the same ingenuity. Right. And one way to do that is to be a little bit unpredictable sometimes.
Well, and if we think about it, with those two numbers, I think we're probably pretty close to needing some type of a ingenious solution right now, because 1.2 quadrillion. That's what I think about this stuff before I try to go to sleep. 1.2 quadrillion, and then 147. And Bob, the part that has disturbed me the most about the unfunded liabilities. 2 months ago, my friend, it was 127. It has grown $20 trillion in the last 60 days.
I know. And just think about how much it's grown just in during our conversation, right? Just while we've been talking, right? It's probably grown like, I don't know, probably some number of billions, right? Just in the time that we've been chatting, So I hope somebody's happy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Well, thank you so much, brother. We'll let's do this again.
I would love to do this again. I tell you, you make me feel like a kid again, because it's like, growing up in a college town as a faculty kid.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm talking to one of my mom's colleagues again. So
I would have been honored to be that. I would have been honored to be that, and it's definitely my great
pleasure beyond my ability to communicate to you. What an enjoyable time I've had speaking with you, my friend, and I very much look forward to doing it again in the future. And I've got a lot of other questions that I'd like to be able to ask you. So I look forward to us getting together again.
We'll do it really soon then. Thanks, my friend. We'll do it, quite flexible. So I've enjoyed this too, and I've learned a ton. So I can't wait for the next one.
All right, that's great. All right, so everybody, now that you know that there's Bob and I are going to get back together again, I need for everyone watching this video that has got a question that you'd like to ask, then make sure and get it to me, and I'll ask him. And everybody, take care, and remember, live long and hodl. All right, take care.
Exactly. All right, thanks all.